There are truths that the world is not ready to hear. And there are people who speak them anyway. This is a story about one of them. She was 11 years old. She stood at the edge of a small mountain town with nothing but a wool blanket, a sack of cornmeal, and a hunting knife with an elk antler handle that had belonged to her father. The blade carried a stain that no amount of scrubbing had ever fully removed. She had stopped trying to remove it a long time ago. Behind her, the town watched from windows and doorways. No one waved. No one called out. The decision had been made the night before, ratified that morning in a church with whitewashed walls and a leaking roof, and now it simply needed to be carried out. So the town stood in silence and watched a child walk away into the wilderness. But before we follow her into those mountains, before we understand what she built there and what she saved and what she chose to do for the people who had chosen to abandon her, there is something you need to know. Many years later, long after the winter that changed everything, a woman was found in a stone dwelling carved into the face of a red gold cliff. She had lived there for more than 6 decades. She had died peacefully in the home she had built with her own hands when she was 11 years old, and she was 74 years old when she went. Above the entrance to that dwelling, chiseled into the sandstone in uneven letters, were words that visitors would photograph and copy and carry home with them for generations. The mountain told me, "I told you. Now we both know." And in the pocket of the coat she wore when she died, folded so many times that the paper had split along every crease, was a letter. Not from a friend, not from a lover, from the one person who had stood at the edge of that town on the morning she was sent away and had said nothing, had done nothing, had simply watched with his hat held against his chest and his eyes pointed at the ground while a child walked into the cold. She had carried that letter for 63 years. Why? That is the question that will follow us through everything that comes next. The answer will not arrive quickly, but when it does, it will change the way you understand every choice she made. For now, go back. Go back to the beginning. Go back to a man named Eli Calloway and the daughter he raised in the high country, where the peaks scraped the belly of the sky, and every season taught a lesson that no schoolroom could. Eli was not the kind of man that towns produce. He was the kind that mountains produce. Quiet, watchful, more comfortable in the company of elk than in the company of people. He had no wife. He had no neighbors. He had Wren, and he had the land. And he believed that between the two of them, those were enough. He began teaching her when she was 7 years old, not reading, not arithmetic, though she learned those too from worn books kept in oilcloth. He taught her to read the land. On a July morning, burning in gold, he took her to a ridge above a river valley and pointed to a grove of trees where a small bird was burying seeds in the earth with frantic, urgent energy. "Watch," he said. She watched. The bird worked with a desperation that seemed wrong for such a warm day. It moved like something racing a clock that only it could hear. "When they store that early," Eli said quietly, "they're saying don't trust the summer." 3 months later, the earliest hard freeze in Eli's memory came down from the north. But Eli had listened to the bird. He had already moved them to lower ground, already laid in enough dried meat and firewood to carry them through. They survived because a small bird had told the truth, and a man had been willing to believe it. "The animals always know," Eli told her that night, the fire burning low between them. They don't have opinions. They don't have pride. They feel what's coming, and they act. Remember that." She remembered. He taught her other things too. How to read stone, which rock holds heat and which crumbles. How sandstone can be worked with patience and the right angle of pressure. How a natural overhang becomes a roof if you understand what it's offering. How a seam of rock, split correctly, becomes a wall. How the ground itself can be made to shelter you if you know how to ask. "If you ever need a home," he told her once, pressing his palm flat against a warm cliff face, "and there is no one to give you one, you build it yourself. Stone holds. And stone holds heat longer than anything else." She was 9 years old when Eli Calloway died. A canyon. A bear with cubs. The details belong to the wilderness and the ravens that found him first. Wren found him 3 days later, following the birds that circled above the canyon in slow, patient loops. She did not cry. Not yet. Eli had taught her that tears were for when you were safe, and she was not safe. There was work to do. She buried him with his own knife. It took most of a day. The ground was rocky and the knife was not meant for digging, but she worked steadily, one careful scrape at a time, the way Eli had taught her to work at anything that seemed impossible. You don't attack the hard thing. You find its grain. You work with what the earth is willing to give. When it was done, she said the only words she knew for moments like that. Not a prayer, but something Eli used to say when he saw something that moved him. The land remembers. She did not wash the knife afterward. She could not bring herself to erase the last physical trace of her father from the only thing he had left behind. Then she walked south toward the nearest settlement, hoping to find something like a life among people. The town of Stonefield did not know what to make of her. A wild child appearing from the high country alone, carrying a blood-stained knife and the particular stillness of someone who has already survived the worst thing imaginable. The townspeople took her in the way you take in a stray, not because you want to, but because turning away feels like something you'll have to answer for. She was passed from household to household over the following 2 years. She worked without being asked. She mended things. She tended animals with a competence that made the men who watched her uneasy. But she never softened into the grateful, pliable orphan they expected. She remained herself, quiet, watchful, certain. The Henderson family kept her for 3 weeks before the wife declared that the girl gave her an uneasy feeling. The Pikes lasted a month before their children complained that Wren stared at things too long. A third family took her in for 2 weeks and then passed her along without explanation, the way you return a borrowed tool you've decided you don't need after all. Clara Maddox kept her the longest. 4 months in the back room of a boarding house, sleeping under a quilt that Clara had made for her own daughter. A daughter taken by fever 6 years earlier. Clara was a widow. She saw something in Wren that the other households had been too uncomfortable to look at long enough to recognize. She saw a child. Clara taught her to sew properly with a thimble and good thread. She fed her until the sharpness left her face. She let her sleep in a real bed with a real pillow. And she told her one evening, in a voice that was both gentle and afraid, to stop saying the things she said. The things about the weather, about what the animals were telling her, about what was coming. People are afraid of what they don't understand, Clara said, and when people are afraid, they get mean. Wren looked at the woman who had been kinder to her than anyone since Eli. If you stay quiet when you know the truth, she said, the quiet becomes a lie. Clara had no answer for that. She sat with it for a long moment, and the silence between them was the silence of a woman who knows a child is right and cannot afford to say so. Wren had warned the town twice before. A flood she saw coming in the behavior of the creek birds. They had dismissed her, and the creek had risen 6 feet in a single night. 3 horses drowned, a frost arriving weeks early. She had told the Garrett family, and old Owen Garrett had listened with polite patience and done nothing. And the frost had come exactly when she said it would and destroyed their late garden. The cabbages, the squash, the last of the season's beans. All of it blackened and collapsed by morning. After the frost, Reverend Aldous Graves called a gathering at the church. He was a tall man with a voice built for certainty, and he used both to devastating effect. He spoke of corruption and darkness and the danger of a child who claimed to know things that only God could know. He spoke of the safety of the community. He spoke until the room nodded the way rooms always nod when a man with a certain kind of voice tells them what they want to hear. What they wanted to hear was that the problem was not their own failure to listen. What they wanted to hear was that the problem was her. That night, he came to Clara's boarding house with a piece of paper and a request for her signature. Wren was asleep in the back room. Clara stood in the doorway, looking at the quilt, at the small hands resting on the pillow, at the child who had asked her nothing except to be allowed to stay. Clara looked at those hands for a long time. She thought about how they had looked when Wren first arrived, raw, cracked, carrying in their palms the evidence of years of outdoor living that no child's hands should show. She thought about the flood, about the frost, about the quiet way Wren accepted being wrong by the world around her, never once saying that the world was wrong about itself. Her hand trembled when she signed. The vote the next morning was swift and decisive. Harriet Voss raised her hand first, without hesitation, as though she had been waiting for the question. Others followed. The motion passed. At the edge of town, as Wren began to walk north, 2 people were waiting. Owen Garrett stood by a fence post with a small canvas bag. He held it out without meeting her eyes. Inside were fishing line, a fire striker, and a length of good leather. His voice, when he finally spoke, was rough with something he couldn't quite name, the sound of a man trying to speak around something lodged in his chest. "Your father would be ashamed of me." Wren looked at him, at the 62-year-old man who had seen the same signs she had seen and chosen not to speak. Her eyes held no anger. Only the steady, quiet certainty that had made every adult in Stonefield uncomfortable since the day she arrived. "My father told me," she said, "that knowing the right thing and not doing it is worse than not knowing at all." Owen nodded. He could not speak again. Tears ran down the cracked leather of his cheeks. She took the bag and walked on. Tobias Voss, Harriet's boy, stood where the road became trail. He was 14 years old and had not raised his hand at the vote, and the not raising had cost him something he was still calculating. He held out a loaf of bread wrapped in cloth, both hands extended. His mother was watching from the porch. He could not follow further without consequences he was not yet old enough to face. "I'm sorry," he said. Wren took the bread. She looked at the boy who had not raised his hand. "Don't be sorry," she said. "Just remember." Then she turned and walked into the wilderness. The aspens on the hills were just beginning to turn, their leaves catching the late sun like scattered coins. It looked, from a distance, like everything a small mountain town was supposed to be. No one inside it knew this was the last warm morning any of them would feel for a very long time. And in his house at the edge of town, Owen Garrett sat down at his kitchen table and began to write a letter he did not yet know he would never deliver himself. The first night alone taught Wren something that Eli had never prepared her for. He had taught her about cold, about hunger, about the particular silence of mountains after dark when the wind drops and the world holds its breath. He had taught her to read weather in the behavior of animals, to find water by following the dip of the land, to start a fire with nothing more than a flat stone and patience and the right kind of dry grass. But he had never taught her what it feels like when the entire world forgets you exist. She walked north through the afternoon and into the early dark, following the foothills where the sagebrush gave way to rocky ground, and the land began its slow climb toward the high country she had known as a child. She ate her cornmeal in small pinches, letting each dissolve before swallowing. She drank from a creek so cold it made her teeth ache. And when the last of the light left the sky and the temperature dropped with it, she wrapped herself in her wool blanket beneath a fallen pine and tried to sleep. The cold was not the cold she remembered from the mountains with Eli. That had been honest cold, sharp cold, cold with a fire at the center of it and another person beside her and the knowledge that morning would come, and they would still be together. This was a different kind, the cold of absence. The cold that seeps in when there is no one ahead of you on the trail, no one who knows your name, no one in the world who is wondering whether you made it through the night. She shivered until her jaw clenched and her muscles cramped and her body pulled itself into the smallest possible shape, as though if she could make herself small enough, she might generate enough warmth to survive inside it. And then, somewhere in the long dark hours before dawn, the thing she had been holding since she was 9 years old broke free. She cried, not loudly, not with any drama. She cried the way a person cries when they have been holding it for 2 years, and the holding itself has become heavier than the grief. She cried for Eli in his canyon, for the grave she had dug alone, with hands too small for the work. She cried for Clara, who had signed a piece of paper that weighed more than any stone. She cried for the quiet hope she had carried into Stonefield, the small, careful hope that she might belong somewhere, anywhere. And for the way that hope had been taken apart in a single morning by people who feared her more than they feared the winter she had warned them was coming. It lasted perhaps 5 minutes. Then she stopped, not because the grief was finished, because she made it stop. She wiped her face with her sleeve. She took 3 slow breaths, and she spoke out loud, to the darkness, to the pines, to whatever part of Eli might still be listening somewhere in the cold night air above those mountains. "All right," she said, "that's enough." She did not cry again, not once, not through everything that followed. In the silence after, lying still with the blanket pulled to her chin, a memory surfaced with the clarity of something that had been waiting for exactly this moment. Eli crouching beside a fire, his arm around her, the wind pressing against the canvas of their tent. Her own voice, small and frightened, "Pa, what if someday I'm all alone?" And his answer, the answer she had carried without fully understanding until now. "Then you build yourself a place. Doesn't have to be big, just has to be warm." She opened her eyes. She stopped shivering. She knew what she had to find. She found it on the second day. The cliff face rose 40 feet above a small valley where a spring seeped from the rocks and fed a narrow creek lined with willows. The stone was red gold sandstone, layered and fractured by years of freeze and thaw, with a natural overhang jutting out from the base like a roof no one had built but the earth itself. Below the overhang, half hidden behind a tangle of dead brush, a crack ran back into the rock. It was narrow, barely wide enough for a child's body to squeeze through sideways, but it opened into a pocket within the stone, roughly 10 feet deep, 8 feet wide, with a ceiling high enough for Wren to stand upright without stooping. She pressed her palm flat against the interior wall. The stone was warm, not hot, not even close to warm by the standards of any room she had slept in, but warmer than the air outside by a margin that mattered. The spring running beneath the cliff carried heat from somewhere deep in the earth, and the rock had been absorbing it for longer than anyone could measure. She smiled. It was the first time her face had done that since the morning she had walked out of Clara Maddox's boarding house. "I found it, Pa," she said softly. Then she got to work. The first week was the hardest thing she had ever done. She worked from first light until her arms shook and her hands could no longer grip the knife. She widened the entrance inch by inch, learning as she went the nature of the stone, where it was soft and cooperative, where it hardened without warning around veins of something denser embedded within it. She learned that sandstone cannot be attacked. It can only be read. You find its grain, its direction, its willingness, and you work with it rather than against it. Eli had told her this about stone the way he had told her everything, not as instruction but as conversation, as though the two of them were simply thinking something through together. She heard his voice constantly in those first days, not as a haunting, as a resource. On the third day, the knife struck a hidden vein of harder rock and the blade chipped along the edge. Wren sat down on the ground and stared at the damage for a long time. The knife was the only precision tool she had, the only thing Eli had left behind in any physical sense. She could feel the weight of what the chip meant, not just practically, but in some other way she didn't have words for yet. She spent half a day at the creek, grinding the blade against a flat river stone in long, careful strokes, working the edge back. It was tedious, methodical work, the kind that strips away everything except the task itself. She found, to her surprise, that she did not mind it. Eli had always said that the most important work was the work that looked like nothing, the preparation that happens before anything dramatic is possible, not as sharp as before, but sharp enough. And she had learned something important in the doing of it. She began using flat creek stones as her primary chisels, saving the knife for detail. She fashioned crude hammers from cobbles lashed to sticks with strips cut from the edge of her blanket, a sacrifice she measured carefully against the cold. Her hands blistered, broke open, bled, and then slowly began to build the thick skin that would never fully soften for the rest of her life. By the end of the first week, the cavity had become a room. She gathered as she went. Deadfall from the valley floor became firewood stacked in bundles she carried on her back. Dry grass became bedding. She carved a fire pit near the entrance where a natural crack in the ceiling drew the smoke upward through the rock, a chimney the mountain had already built, waiting for someone to find the sense to use it. She set snares for rabbits, caught her first on the fourth day, cooked the meat, and began the slow work of curing the hide. Pine nuts from the valley floor, rose hips from the creek bushes, bitter but full of something the body needed. Roots packed in dry grass. Firewood stacked tight against the back wall. She built her stores the way Eli had taught her to think about winter, not as a season to survive, but as a test you prepare for all year, so that when it arrives, it finds you ready. She was not entirely alone. On the 5th morning, a red fox appeared at the creek. Young, lean, fur the color of old pennies. He drank from the water, raised his head, and looked directly at her across 20 feet of still morning air. Neither of them moved. Neither of them ran. The fox sat down on his haunches and watched her work for the better part of an hour. Then he trotted back into the brush. He came back the next morning, and the morning after that. Wren named him Copper. He never let her close enough to touch. He never came within 15 feet. But he was there, a steady orange presence at the edge of her days. And for a child who had been abandoned by every human being she had ever trusted, the company of a creature who simply chose to be near her was worth more than she could have explained. It was in the 2nd week that she found the words carved into the back wall of the cave. She had been working on the far interior, widening a natural alcove to use for storage, when the firelight caught something she had not noticed in the rougher surfaces near the entrance. Letters, cut into the sandstone with something thinner and more precise than her own tools. Someone had taken time with these. Someone had cared about being legible, a name she didn't recognize, and beneath it, a single sentence. I was wrong to stay silent. Wren ran her fingertip along the cut letters. The stone was smooth inside the carving, worn by years of air moving over it. This had not been written recently. Whoever had lived here before her, whoever had sheltered in this same warmth, beside this same fire pit crack, beneath this same natural chimney, had left behind not a claim or a boast or an instruction, but a confession. I was wrong to stay silent. Wrong about what? Wrong to whom? When had they been here? And why had they left? And had they ever come back? She stared at the words for a long time in the flickering light. Then she got back to work. But the question stayed with her. It would stay with her through the rest of the winter and into the spring and beyond, sitting quietly at the back of her mind like a coal that has stopped flaming, but not stopped burning. The cave had become something she was beginning, privately, to call home. The entrance, widened and fitted with a door she had built from fallen aspens and rawhide strips, now sealed against the wind with a tightness that still surprised her each time she pulled it shut. The fire pit drew perfectly, carrying smoke up through the rock without filling the interior. The walls were smooth where she had worked them. The floor was level and clean, covered in layers of dry grass that she replaced every few days. A small alcove in the rear wall held her growing stores. She had started to allow herself to believe she might actually make it. That was when Cole Briggs arrived. She heard them before she saw them. 3 boys from Stonefield, making no effort to be quiet, crashing through the brush on the valley floor with the particular confidence of young men who have never had reason to believe that the world will push back against them. Cole Briggs led the group. He was 13, big for his age, with his father's blacksmith shoulders and a mouth that had learned early that cruelty, aimed at the right target, bought a certain standing among peers. He had been the one who organized the betting pool back in town. The small, mean wager about how long the mountain witch would last before the cold drove her crawling back to beg for a bed. He had collected coins from 6 other boys. He had been losing the bet for 2 weeks now, which had not improved his temperament. He saw the cave entrance, the fitted door, the thin line of smoke rising from the crack above. And his expression cycled through surprise, then calculation, then something that settled into the particular sneer of someone who has decided that another person's accomplishment is actually an offense. "Well," he called out, "look at that. The witch built herself a hole." Wren stepped outside. She stood in front of the door with her arms at her sides and her dark eyes steady on his face. She had grown up reading weather in the behavior of animals, and she could read this the same way. The posturing, the quick look at his companions, the way his chin lifted when he spoke, checking for the approval of an audience. She had seen this before. In every household, in every gathering where one person needed to make another person small in order to feel large themselves. "You came a long way," she said. Her voice was calm. "Did you need something?" Cole laughed, but it was a performance. "Just wanted to see how long before you freeze." He looked at the door, the smoke, the stacked firewood visible through the narrow entrance. His expression flickered with something that wasn't mockery, something closer to the curiosity he was trying very hard to suppress. "Must be nice, having a witch hole." "It is," Wren said. "It's warm." Silence. The other two boys looked at Cole, waiting for their cue. "We took bets," Cole said, "about when you'd give up." "I know," Wren said. That landed differently than he expected. He had been ready for fear or anger, not for simple acknowledgement, not for those eyes looking at him with the patient, unhurried attention of someone who has already decided he isn't a threat. "What's it like?" he said, shifting his weight. "Being out here alone?" "Quiet," Wren said. "You should try it sometime. You might learn something." Cole opened his mouth to answer. Then he closed it. Something she had said, quietly, without heat, had caught in his mind like a splinter, and he couldn't immediately identify which part of him it had caught in. He turned away, led his companions back into the trees, made noise about coming back when she'd finally given up, made noise about a lot of things that had nothing to do with what he was actually thinking. Wren watched him go. She was not afraid of Cole Briggs. She was something closer to sad for him. The way you are sad for an animal that has learned the wrong lesson about how to survive. She went back inside. She added wood to the fire. She began the evening work of checking her stores and planning the next day. What Cole Briggs thought or felt on the ride back towards Stonefield was not nothing. It was the beginning of something he didn't have a name for yet, something that had been planted against his will by a girl who had looked at him without flinching and offered him, without softness, the truth. In the days that followed Cole's visit, Wren worked with a new kind of steadiness. Not urgency, she had always had urgency, but something more settled beneath it. Something that came from having been tested and found solid. The cave was no longer a project. It was becoming a philosophy. She built a second alcove in the upper wall, above the level of any snow that might blow through the entrance crack. She experimented with packing the walls with a mixture of dry clay from the creek bank and grass fiber, pressing it into the natural seams and letting it harden. Eli had never taught her this specifically, but he had taught her to watch, and she had watched the way birds packed their nests, not randomly, but with intention, choosing materials for specific properties. The clay mix held heat differently than bare stone. She could feel it against her palm. It was a small difference. Small differences, Eli had always said, are the only kind that matter in the long run. She began to understand the cave the way you understand a living thing. Not all at once, but in accumulated conversations. The way the fire's warmth moved through the space in the hours after it was built up. The cold zones near the lower edges of the walls where the floor met the stone, and the warmer band above. The particular sound the wind made against the cliff face when it was coming from the north versus the west, and what each direction predicted about the weather to follow. She added a second snare line along the upper creek, where the rabbit runs were more established and the brush denser. She caught 3 in one morning, and spent the better part of a day processing them, meat dried and stored. Skins stretched on a frame of green willow she had bent and lashed while it was still pliable. She was building toward something she could feel the shape of, even if she could not yet name it. The particular security of a life that has enough margin that a single bad week does not destroy it. Copper watched all of this from his various vantage points with the thoughtful attention of a supervisor who has decided the work is going satisfactorily and sees no reason to interfere. Wren had begun to think of him not as company exactly, but as a kind of running commentary on the natural world. When Copper was relaxed and present, things were as they should be. When he was absent or alert, something had changed. He was, she had realized, another instrument for reading the land, one that operated on her behalf without needing to be asked. She thought about this often. How much of what Eli had taught her was actually about learning to receive information that was already present and freely offered. The land was not stingy with its knowledge. It shared what it knew continuously, to anyone who would learn to pay the right kind of attention. The difficult thing was not finding the information. The difficult thing was being willing to act on it, even when acting on it meant changing your plans, moving your camp, going without the summer's ease because a bird had been burying seeds in July. People, she had concluded, found this last part very hard. Not the listening exactly, but the willingness to let what you heard rearrange what you intended. It required a kind of humility about the future that was uncomfortable for creatures who had built their sense of safety on the belief that they could plan their way out of uncertainty. She did not judge them for it. She understood it. She had done it herself once. She had been 9 years old, and Eli had said they needed to move their camp before the first snow, and some part of her had resisted because the camp was comfortable, and the move was work, and she was tired. She had not said so out loud. She had simply been slower than usual about gathering her things, and Eli, who noticed everything, had looked at her and said, "I know you'd rather stay. The mountain doesn't care what we'd rather." They had moved. The snow had come 3 days earlier than any previous year Eli could remember. The old campsite had been buried under 2 feet of it. She thought about that now, curing rabbit skins in the orange afternoon light, Copper watching from the creek bank with his tail curled neatly around his paws. The mountain doesn't care what we'd rather. Frank Reeves came on a gray afternoon 2 weeks after Cole's visit, and he was a different kind of problem entirely. He emerged from the brush without warning. A large man, perhaps 50, with a matted beard and the particular vacancy in the eyes of someone who has been moving without a destination for long enough that the movement itself has become the point. A miner, from the look of his boots and the pick handle jutting from his pack. 3 days without food. From the look of everything else. He saw the cliff. He saw the carved entrance and the fitted door and the smoke rising from above, and his expression changed in a way Wren recognized immediately. the same way she had seen adults look at things they wanted and believed they deserved more than the person who had them. "That's a fine setup," he said, his voice carrying a forced friendliness that was actually a kind of warning. "Mighty fine for a kid out here alone." Ren said nothing. "How about you let me stay the night?" "Not a question. I'll keep watch, protect you. A little girl out here by herself. You need someone looking after you." He said protect the way Reverend Graves said salvation, as a word whose meaning had long since separated from the thing it was supposed to describe. "No," Ren said. Reeves stopped smiling. "Now, listen here. 3 days without a meal, and you're sitting on enough to last a month. You're being selfish is what you are." He took a step forward, then another. His size filled the space between them. Ren drew the knife. The elk antler handle settled into her palm with the ease of something she had held 10,000 times. The blade, shorter now from the day she had mended it, caught the flat gray light. Her hand did not shake. Her eyes did not move from his. She had used this knife to bury her father. She had used it to build herself a home from solid rock. She would use it for this too, if she had to. And something in the quality of her stillness communicated this with a clarity that no words could have matched. "Step back," she said. "This is my home. I built it. You didn't. Leave." Frank Reeves looked at the knife, and then he looked at her eyes, and something in them gave him pause. Not the blade, but the look behind the blade. The look of a person who has already lost everything, and therefore has nothing left to lose except the thing she had built from nothing. He stepped back. He turned and crashed back into the brush and was gone. Ren stood motionless until the sound of his footsteps faded completely. Then her body began to tremble, not from fear, from anger. The clean, righteous anger of someone whose sanctuary has been threatened by a person who did not build it and does not deserve it. That night, she sat alone in the firelight, and for the first time since she had told herself that's enough and stopped crying, she came close to making the wrong decision. She thought about it plainly, the way Eli had taught her to think about hard things, without flinching, without dressing the truth in anything softer than it was. She thought about what returning to Stonefield would actually cost. A warm room. A meal that didn't require 3 hours of preparation. No one arriving in the afternoon to threaten what she had built. She thought, maybe it isn't worth it. Maybe nothing that can be taken this easily is worth fighting for. She sat with that thought for a long time. The fire shifted. A log settled. The creak outside was a murmur she had come to know as well as her own breathing. Then she felt more than heard the faint memory of stone under her palms. The grain of it, the warmth of it, the slow, patient heat that the earth had been storing in this rock for longer than any human being had been standing upright. "Stone holds," Eli had said. "And stone holds heat longer than anything else." She stood up. She carved a bolt channel into the inside of the door frame. A thick branch, trimmed and fitted, that could be slid into the channel from within. She worked by firelight until it was done and tested it 3 times. Then she lay down in her grass bedding and slept. She did not go back. Not for warmth. Not for food, not for the company of people who had already told her exactly what they thought she was worth. Ghost came in the late autumn, when frost had turned the valley grass white, and the willows along the creek had gone silver at the edges. She was a mare, young, with a coat the color of wood ash and a mane so pale it seemed almost white in the early light. She appeared in the valley meadow one morning without explanation, moving through the frozen grass with the cautious grace of a creature that has survived by trusting nothing. Wren understood that feeling in her own body. She did not approach the mare on the first day, or the second, or the third. She sat on a rock near the creek with her back straight and her hands visible, and she simply existed in the same space as the horse, asking for nothing, offering nothing except stillness. She had learned patience from Eli, and she understood that some things cannot be taken. They can only be waited for. On the fourth day, the mare came closer. On the sixth, she ate dry grass from a spot 6 feet from where Wren sat. On the eighth, Wren stood slowly and extended her open hand. The mare bolted, not far, 30 yards, then stopped, turned, watched, but far enough to make clear that this would not be given cheaply. Eli had told her once that a horse that has been hurt enough will test you before it trusts you. Not to be cruel, to find out if you are the kind of person who stays. Most people aren't, he had said. Be the kind that is. She had asked him how you know when to keep going and when to let something go. He had looked at her for a long time before answering. You know, he said finally. You always know. The question is whether you're willing to be honest about what you know. On the 9th day, Wren tried again. She walked toward the horse slowly, talking low, holding out a handful of dried grass. The mare's ears moved forward and back. Her nostrils flared. And without warning, she pivoted and kicked out with a rear hoof that caught Wren square in the ribs and sent her down hard into the frozen ground. The pain was immediate and enormous. Wren lay on her back, unable to draw a full breath, something grinding in her left side when she tried to move. Not broken. She decided this after a long, careful inventory of what her body was telling her. Badly bruised. The kind of bruised where every breath for the next week would be a small act of courage. She lay still until she could breathe again. Then she sat up. Then she stood. She looked at the mare, who had stopped 30 yards away and was watching her with large, careful eyes. I know, Wren said quietly. I know you didn't mean to. I know you were scared. She walked back to the cave. She did not try again that day. The next morning she was there at the creek again, sitting on her rock, making no demands. And the morning after that. And the morning after that. On the 14th day, the mare walked to her. Just walked, ears forward, neck low, with the deliberate, unhurried movement of a creature that has made a decision and is done being uncertain about it. She stopped 2 feet away. She lowered her nose toward Wren's extended hand. Wren did not move. She barely breathed. The mare exhaled, long, slow, a sound like a question finally answered. Wren named her Ghost for the color of her coat and the quiet of her arrival. That night, Ghost stood in the small secondary chamber Wren had carved earlier and lined with pine boughs, and her warmth spread through the entire cave system in a way that changed everything. The temperature inside climbed by degrees that Wren could feel against her skin, in her hands, in the ease of her breathing. For the first time since she had left Stonefield, she slept without her coat. She lay in the dark and listened to the sound of another living creature breathing steadily nearby. Ghost's breathing was slow and rhythmic, a sound like the earth itself settling into rest, and Wren found that her own breathing began to match it without her trying. She thought about what Eli had told her once about the difference between alone and lonely. Alone is a condition, he had said. Lonely is a choice you make about what that condition means. She was alone. She was not lonely. And far away, in a town that didn't know what was coming, a reverend was descending into a cellar beneath his church and tallying what he had taken, and a 14-year-old boy was watching from the shadow of a vestibule, and an old man was sitting at a kitchen table trying to put into words what he should have said out loud a long time ago. But Wren didn't know any of that yet. She only knew that the stone was warm and the horse was breathing, and somewhere outside in the brush, a fox the color of old copper had settled in for the night. The earth never lies, only people do. And the earth, on this night, was telling her she had done enough. For today, for now, rest. She listened. She always listened. The signs began in the deep part of autumn, when the light turned thin and the shadows stretched long across the valley floor, even at midday. Wren noticed them the way she noticed everything, not all at once, but in accumulation. One small truth layered on top of another until the picture they formed together was impossible to misread. The first was copper. For weeks he had come to the creek each morning at the same hour, with the reliability of something that had decided on its own terms to be dependable. He drank. He watched her work. He sat in the brush at the edge of her visible world like a small orange lamp that someone had left burning. She had come to count on him without quite admitting to herself that she was counting on anything. Then one morning he didn't come. Wren sat on her rock and waited longer than usual. The creek ran, the willows moved. The sky above the valley was a pale, colorless white. Not gray exactly, not white, but something between the two that carried a quality of pressure, as though the air itself was being compressed from above by something enormous and patient and indifferent to the creatures living beneath it. She went back to work. She noted the absence the way she noted all information, without judgment, without panic, but with the attention of someone who has learned that the world does not send its messages twice. When an animal changes its behavior, the change is the message. You don't need to understand exactly what it means to understand that it means something. The second sign was ghost. The mare had settled into the routines of the cave with an ease that still occasionally surprised Wren. Always returning before dark, always entering the secondary chamber with the calm certainty of a creature that has found its place. Ghost was not a nervous animal. She had been once. But she had decided to trust, and the decision had steadied her. Now she was nervous again. She paced, not wildly, but with a low, persistent restlessness, hooves shifting, head moving, nostrils working the air for something her nose could detect that no human instrument could measure. She would settle for a few minutes, then rise again. Settle, rise. Her ears moved constantly, swiveling toward sounds that Wren could not hear. When Ghost did not sleep, Wren could not sleep either. She lay awake and listened to the horse listening, and what she heard in Ghost's listening was a kind of eloquent dread. Wren stood at the mouth of her cave and looked at the sky for a long time. The third sign was the temperature of the stone itself. She pressed her palm against the interior wall, as she did every morning, reading the warmth the rock had stored overnight. It was cooler than it had been. Not dramatically, just enough to notice. The deep earth was pulling heat downward, drawing it back from the surface, the way creatures do when they sense that exposure is coming, and instinct says to protect the core. She went inside, packed what she needed, saddled Ghost, and rode toward Stonefield. It had been weeks since she had seen the town. Long enough that the sight of it, The familiar cluster of wooden buildings, the church steeple, the smoke rising from the general store's chimney, produced in her something that was not quite nostalgia and not quite pain, but lived in the territory between them. She tied Ghost to a post at the edge of town and went on foot. The first house she came to. She knocked. The door opened. The woman who answered moved quickly through surprise, discomfort, and something close to shame before settling on careful blankness. "The winter is coming early," Wren said. "Worse than anyone in this town has seen. You need to lay in more supplies, more firewood than you think you'll need. Check your roof. Check your walls." The woman looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "Thank you, dear," in the tone of someone speaking to a child who has said something charming but incorrect, and closed the door. Wren went to the next house, and the next, and the next after that. The responses varied in their particulars, but not in their substance. Polite dismissal, impatient dismissal. One man laughed. A woman told her neighbor, loud enough to be heard, that the mountain witch was at it again. An elderly farmer said he had been reading weather for 40 years and saw nothing unusual in the sky. At the general store, 3 men were drinking coffee when Wren came in. They fell silent when they saw her. She told them what she had told everyone else, the signs she had read, the preparations she believed were necessary, the particular urgency she felt in the accumulated weight of everything the land was telling her. One of the men, the store owner who had coined the name Witch's Den for her cave, set his cup down. "I think a girl who lives in a hole in the ground is maybe not the most reliable judge of what's normal." The other 2 laughed. Wren looked at the store owner without expression. "You have a daughter," she said. "She's 4 years old. Make sure she has a way to get warm that doesn't depend on the building staying intact." She left before he could answer. Reverend Graves was coming down the church steps when she reached him. He stopped where he was, waiting with the particular stillness of a man who believes that remaining stationary is a form of authority. "I need to speak to the congregation," Wren said. "I need to tell them what I've been seeing, what's coming." Graves looked at her with an expression of serene certainty that she recognized from his pulpit manner, the look of a man who has mistaken his own confidence for divine assurance. Behind it, she could see something else, something quick and uncomfortable that his composure almost, but not quite, managed to conceal. She had seen that look before, in the eyes of animals that sense a predator but have not yet decided whether to run. It was the look of a man who knows, on some level, he will not permit himself to access, that the child in front of him is right. "Only God knows what weather is coming," he said. "The rest of us trust in His provision." "With respect," Wren said, "God's provision tends to work better when people have prepared. The congregation does not need to hear from you," he said. "What they need is faith. What you are offering is fear. What they need," Wren said quietly, "is firewood." She turned and walked back toward the edge of town. Cole Briggs was leaning against the fence post where she had tied Ghost. He straightened when she approached, assembling whatever it was he planned to say. The performance being put together on short notice for an audience that had mostly dispersed, but whose imagined presence he still required. "The mountain witch is scared of clouds," he called out, loud enough for 2 men across the street to hear. Wren untied Ghost. She looked at Cole, not with anger, not with contempt, but with something that was harder to receive than either of those, something that saw him clearly and was simply sad about what it saw. The betting pool, she said. Have you ended it yet? Cole said nothing. You should end it, she said. Not because of what's coming, because of what the betting itself says about the kind of person you're becoming. She mounted Ghost and rode north without looking back. Behind her, Cole Briggs stood at the fence post with his performance dissolved around him and nothing to replace it. He thought about what she had said with the helpless attention of someone who has been handed a truth they are not ready for and cannot put back down. Owen Garrett died on a Tuesday. Wren did not know this. She was 3 miles into the mountains, repairing a section of the cave wall where a hairline fracture had allowed cold air to seep through, when Owen Garrett gathered his family around him and did the thing that every living creature eventually does. He was 62 years old. His body had simply run through what it had been given, and the long, cold weeks had hastened the accounting. He died in his bed, which was the only mercy the season had yet offered anyone in Stonefield. Owen Garrett had lived his whole life in the shadow of these mountains. He had watched them change with every season and called himself a man who knew what the land was saying. He had known. That was the weight his son saw in his father's face at the end. Not the weight of dying, but the weight of what had been carried too long and put down too late. A man's face at the end of his life will show you everything he failed to do, if you know how to look. He had told himself on the morning he pressed the survival bag into Wren's hands that the cave might not still be there, that the entrance might have collapsed in the years since, that telling her about it and being wrong would give her false hope in a place where false hope could kill. He had told himself many things over those 2 years of her time in Stonefield. None of them were true. He had been afraid, and the afraid man is always the last to know it. Before he died, he called his son to his side. His voice had the quality of a man who has run out of time, compressed, urgent, stripped of everything that isn't essential. "In my coat," he said, "the inside pocket. There's a letter." His son looked at him. "Give it to the Calloway girl," Owen said. "If she's alive." His son opened his mouth. "She's alive," Owen said, with a certainty that required no explanation. "Give it to her." His son took the letter from the coat without reading it and put it in his own pocket, where it would remain through everything that followed. A message from a dead man to a girl the whole town had assumed was dead, carrying in its folded pages a truth that Owen Garrett had spent most of his adult life failing to speak aloud. The cold arrived 3 days later, not gradually, not with the polite warning of an early frost or the familiar creeping chill of a normal season's turning. It came the way a door slams, with suddenness and finality, as though the world had simply decided to become a different kind of place and had not felt the need to consult anyone living in it. Wren was at the cave entrance when the temperature dropped. She felt it against her face first. The quality of the air changing in a single drawn breath from cold to something that had moved past cold, into a category that did not have a comfortable name. She went inside and pulled the door shut and slid the bolt. Ghost shifted in the secondary chamber. Wren pressed her palm to the interior wall and felt the stone giving back its stored heat with the slow, reliable generosity she had been counting on. The warmth held. However cold it was outside, the mountain kept its promise. She added wood to the fire and sat close to it and listened. The wind came first as sound, a low moan building at the edge of the valley that rose quickly into something that ceased to sound like wind and began to sound like intention. like something alive and purposeful that had traveled a very long distance to arrive at exactly this place, at exactly this moment. It hit the cliff face with a force she could feel through the stone, a shudder that passed through the rock and into her palms and up her arms and through her chest, as though the mountain itself was acknowledging what was coming. Then the snow, not the soft hiss of ordinary snow, but a hard, driven sound, like thrown sand, like something insisting on entry through every gap and weakness in every barrier that human or animal had ever built against the cold. The temperature outside, she could feel even through the door's edges, was falling and not stopping. She thought about Stonefield, about the houses she had visited that afternoon, the doors that had closed in her face with such practiced ease, about the store owner's daughter, 4 years old, and whether her father had checked the roof the way Wren had told him to. She thought about Clara Maddox's boarding house, which she knew had a gap in the north wall that let in a draft she had felt on her own skin during the months she had lived there. She thought about a lot of things she had no power to fix from here. Ghost exhaled in the next chamber, a long, slow breath that fogged in the air and then dissolved. Wren pulled her knees to her chest and sat with everything she was feeling, and did not pretend it wasn't there. This was not satisfaction. What she felt was not the vindication she might have expected, not the cold comfort of being right when everyone else had been wrong. What she felt was grief. The particular grief of someone who has tried to give a gift and watched it refused, and now must wait in the warm dark, while the people who refused it suffer for the refusal. She did not want to be right. She had never wanted to be right. She had only wanted them to listen. The earth never lies. Only people do. She added another piece of wood to the fire. She hated that she was warm. The first night passed. The second day brought no break in the storm. The third day, the same. She slept in short intervals, waking each time the wind changed pitch, assessing temperature, sound, the feel of the air, ghosts breathing, before allowing herself to sleep again. She ate carefully from her stores. She kept the fire at exactly the level required, enough to maintain the warmth, not so much as to exhaust her wood supply before the storm broke. Every calculation she made was a small act of the discipline Eli had drilled into her, the understanding that survival is not a single heroic act, but 10,000 careful ones, each invisible, each necessary. In the long hours she stayed awake, she thought about Stonefield in a way she hadn't allowed herself before. She thought about the specific people, not abstractions like the town or the people who voted, but Gerald's daughter May, who was 4 years old and had not voted for anything. She thought about James Briggs, Cole's younger brother, who was 7 and had spent his whole short life being told that the Mountain Witch was something to be afraid of. She thought about the children whose parents had made choices they were too young to understand, who would grow up inside the consequences of a morning's vote, the way you grow up inside a house, not choosing it, simply finding yourself there. This was the part that was hardest to hold without anger. The children. She held it anyway. Eli had taught her that anger, like fire, is useful when contained and dangerous when it runs away from you. Feel it, he had said once, when she was young and furious about something she no longer remembered. Feel all of it, then decide what to do with it. Because anger that's been decided about is a tool. Anger that hasn't is just a fire in your house. She felt it. Then she decided what to do with it. She was going to open her door when they came. That was the decision. She had made it quietly, alone in the warm dark while the storm made its case against every wall and window in the valley below. Not because they deserved it, not because she had forgiven them, because Eli had taught her that the capacity to help is itself a kind of obligation, and because the children had not voted, and because she was not the mountain, cold and indifferent and without choice. But something the mountain could never be. The knocking came on the fourth night. She was awake when she heard it, had been awake for an hour, listening to a change in the wind's pitch that she was still working out the meaning of. A sharp, deliberate sound at the door. 3 blows. A pause. 3 more. Not an animal. Animals don't knock with that kind of intention. She took the knife from its place beside the fire pit and moved to the door. She did not open it immediately. She listened. Please. A woman's voice, high, strained, scraped almost into nothing by cold and wind. Please. There's a child. He's not. Please. Wren unbolted the door. The cold hit her like a physical thing. A wall of it, immediate and enormous, carrying the force of days of accumulated fury. She could see almost nothing in the dark and the driven snow, but she could see the shape of a woman, and in the woman's arms, a small shape bundled in everything the woman had been able to pile onto him. The child's lips were the color of a winter sky. Wren stepped back. Come in. They came in, the woman, the child, and behind them, 2 more adults who had been standing slightly back in the dark, as though uncertain of their welcome. One of them was the store owner, the man who had laughed at her in his shop, the man who had made the joke about a hole in the ground. He came through the door without meeting her eyes. Wren closed the door behind them. She bolted it. She went to the fire and built it up quickly, efficiently, without drama or comment. There was no time for drama. There was work to do. Put him here, she said, indicating the space nearest the fire. On the grass. All of it off him except the innermost layer, then cover him again. His skin needs to feel the warmth before the fabric does. The woman did exactly as she was told. Her hands shook so badly that Wren helped her with the outermost wrappings. The child, he was perhaps 4 years old, lay still with the particular stillness of someone who has stopped fighting, because fighting takes energy, and energy is what he no longer had. Wren worked quickly. Warm stones from beside the fire, not hot, placed near the child's core. Willow bark steeped in water from the heated creek stone she kept near the pit. Eli's remedy, demonstrated to her once beside a winter fire, stored in her memory against exactly this kind of need. She was not gentle in her movements, but she was precise. There was no time for gentleness. Gentleness is a luxury that arrives after the crisis has passed. More knocking, more shapes at the door. A family whose roof had come down under the snow's weight. An elderly man who had been heating his house with furniture and had run out of things to burn. 2 young men who had been caught away from shelter when the storm intensified and had walked toward the only light they could identify. The faint glow of smoke above the cliff face, rising even through the storm. Wren let them all in. Each time she opened the door, the cold tried to follow, and each time she closed it against the cold with the same calm decisiveness. She organized the interior space with the authority of someone who has thought carefully about how many people a space can hold, and what each of them needs, in what order. The most fragile near the fire. the able-bodied near the walls. The horse chamber, warmer now with ghost's heat and the shared breath of 24 people, could absorb the overflow. Cole Briggs came with his family an hour after the first wave. His father's roof had not collapsed, but the north wall had given way in the sustained wind, and the temperature inside had plummeted within minutes. Cole came through Wren's door carrying his younger brother on his back. The boy's face pale, but his eyes open and aware. Cole set his brother down where Wren indicated. He straightened. He looked at Wren across the crowded, fire-lit cave. She was already moving to the next person who needed help. She did not pause for the moment that part of him had been bracing for. The reckoning, the reversal where the power shifts visibly from one person to another. She simply moved past him and helped the next person in the same way she had helped everyone else. He stood there for a moment, understanding something about her that he had not understood before. Then he went to the fire, sat down beside his brother, and pulled the boy close. Harriet Voss arrived near midnight with her son Tobias. Harriet, who had raised her hand without hesitation. Harriet, who in the life of 3 weeks ago had been the most certain person in any room she entered. She came through the door and stopped just inside it, holding the edge of the frame with both hands, as though deciding whether she had the right to let go of it. She looked at Wren. Wren looked back. "Come in," Wren said. The same words she had said to everyone else, without softness, without edge, simply accurate. There was room. There was warmth. "Come in." Harriet let go of the door frame. The last person to knock was Clara Maddox. Wren heard the sound and knew it before she opened the door. Something in the pattern of it, 3 careful knocks with a slight hesitation between the second and third that she had learned during 4 months in the boarding house. The sound of a woman who does everything with a slight pause before committing, as though each action is a decision being made fresh each time. She opened the door. Clara stood in the storm with her coat covered in snow and her hair loose around her face, and her eyes carrying something that had nothing to do with the cold. Something that had been building since the night she had picked up a pen in her own kitchen and signed a piece of paper while a child slept in the next room under a quilt made for a daughter who was gone. She was not crying. She was past crying. She was at the place on the far side of tears, where what remains is simply the truth, stripped of everything that was covering it. "I know," she said. Her voice was barely audible above the wind. "I know I have no right to ask." Wren looked at her for a long moment. 23 people already inside. 23 people whose presence in this cave was the direct result of everything Wren had built here, alone, after everyone, including this woman, had decided she was not worth protecting. She thought about the quilt made for another daughter. She thought about the 4 months of something that had felt like home. She thought about the weight of a pen in a trembling hand, and about the fact that trembling means you know. It means some part of you understands what you are doing, even as you do it. She stepped back from the door. "Come in," she said. "Get warm." Clara crossed the threshold. The door closed. The bolt slid home. Outside, the storm continued its work, vast and indifferent, pressing against every structure human hands had built in the valley below, finding the weaknesses and exploiting them with the patient thoroughness of something that has no opinion about the outcome, only about the doing. Inside the stone cave, 24 people breathed together. The fire burned. Ghost stood in the next chamber and exhaled long, slow clouds of warmth into the air. And Wren Calloway, 11 years old, Alone in the world in every way that counted, the girl the town had sent into the wilderness to die moved through the crowded space with the quiet authority of someone who had made this place and knew every inch of it. She said, "Move closer to the fire. There's room." She said, "Here, drink this slowly." She said, "Your hands are going to hurt when they warm up. That's what warming up feels like. It means it's working." She said simply and repeatedly the only thing that needed to be said: "You're going to be all right. You're inside now. You're going to be all right." The earth had told her everything. She had listened. She had prepared. And now the people who had refused to listen were inside the preparation she had built, kept alive by knowledge she had received and honored and used. Not because they deserved it, not because they had earned it, because she could. Because Eli had taught her that the capacity to help is itself a kind of obligation, that mercy, in the end, is not something you feel, it is something you do. The fire burned, the stone held its warmth, and outside in the locked church where a reverend sat alone with his Bible open on his lap and his cellar full of what he had taken, the storm continued its long conversation with everything that had been built on a foundation of something other than truth. That conversation would reach its conclusion by morning. By the second hour, the cave had become something none of them had a name for. Not a shelter, exactly. Shelters are temporary, places you pass through on the way to somewhere else. Not a home, not yet. Something in between. A held breath, a shared decision to stay alive until morning and worry about everything else after. Wren organized them the way Eli had taught her to organize a camp, not by preference or sentiment, but by need. The most vulnerable nearest the fire, the elderly and the very young in the interior, where the stone had stored the deepest heat, the able-bodied along the walls, where the temperature was lower but still survivable, and where they could be useful. Passing water, feeding wood to the fire, watching the children so the mothers could rest. She did this without asking permission and without explanation. In a crisis, authority belongs to whoever knows what to do. And in this particular space, that person was 11 years old and had dark braided hair and eyes that had stopped apologizing for what they saw. Harriet Voss, who had spent 45 years being the person who organized every room she entered, found herself being organized. She opened her mouth once, a reflex, the beginning of a sentence that had always started with, "in my opinion," and then she closed it again. She picked up the water vessel she had been handed and did what she had been told to do. It was the first time in Harriet Voss's adult life that she had simply done what she was told. It felt, unexpectedly, like putting down something very heavy. The store owner's name was Gerald, and his daughter's name was May. May was 4 years old. She had arrived at the cave door with her face pinched white and her lips the color of a winter sky, and she had not made a sound. Not crying, not asking, not speaking. Just present in her father's arms with the particular silence of a child who has decided that the adults around her are frightened enough without her adding to it. Wren worked on May the same way she had worked on the boy who had arrived first. Warm stones near the core, not on the skin, and the slow, careful process of bringing the temperature up gradually rather than shocking a cold body with sudden heat. Gerald crouched beside his daughter and watched, a large man accustomed to being the most capable person in any practical situation. His hands useless now in a way he had never experienced before. "Is she?" he started. "Her color is coming back," Wren said without looking up. See the edges of her lips? That pink there. That's what you want to see. Gerald looked. He saw it. He exhaled a breath he had been holding so long it had become structural, part of the architecture of his terror rather than simply air in his lungs. May opened her eyes. She looked at Ren with the direct, uncomplicated attention of very young children who have not yet learned to filter their seeing through the categories adults construct. "Your hands are warm," May said. "Yes," Ren said. "How?" "I've been keeping them that way." May considered this. Then she reached out and wrapped both her small hands around two of Ren's fingers, the way a child holds on to something she intends to keep. Ren let her. She kept working with her other hand, monitoring May's return to herself. Gerald watched his daughter holding on to the girl he had laughed at in his store. He watched the color continuing to return, the small chest rising and falling with increasing steadiness. He did not say anything. There were no words available to him that were equal to the situation. He simply crouched in the warmth of a cave that a child had built from stone, and he understood, with the slow, terrible clarity of a man who has been wrong about something important, exactly what he had done and what it had cost and how close the accounting had come. The night deepened around them. Outside, the storm continued its work. Inside, the rhythms of 24 people slowly synchronized. Breathing steadied, children slept. Adults who had been rigid with fear began one by one to let their bodies rest against the stone walls and feel the accumulated warmth that the rock gave back. The cave was not comfortable. The floor was hard. The space was close. The air smelled of smoke and damp wool and the particular animal warmth of Ghost's presence from the next chamber. But it was warm. It was, against all reasonable expectation, warm. Ghost moved occasionally in the secondary chamber, a shift of weight, a soft exhalation, and the children who were still awake found their eyes moving toward the sound with something closer to wonder than fear. The great gray mare standing in the stone room adjacent to them, her breath visible in the fire-lit air, her presence a kind of miracle that none of them had expected when they knocked on the door of this particular cave. Cole's younger brother, James, 7 years old, had been watching Ghost for an hour from his spot near the fire. He was warm now, fully warm, the fear replaced by something more bearable. He looked at Cole. "Can I go see the horse?" "Ask her," Cole said, nodding toward Ren. James waited until Ren looked his way. "Can I go see the horse? I'll be quiet." Ren studied him for a moment, assessing, the way she assessed everything. "Yes, don't startle her. Walk slowly and let her smell your hand before you touch her." James went. He walked slowly, as instructed. He extended his hand. Ghost lowered her head and breathed across the boy's palm. And he stood very still, with his eyes wide and his mouth open in an expression of absolute, uncomplicated joy. "She's so soft," he said, barely above a whisper. Cole watched his brother. Something in his face shifted in a way that was not entirely comfortable. The particular discomfort of someone encountering their own capacity for feeling in a context they were not prepared for. He had spent a long time building walls around the softer parts of himself, the way boys learn to do when softness gets punished. Watching James with Ghost, he felt one of those walls move. He looked at Ren. She had already moved on to the next task. It was Clara who noticed the sick boy's breathing first. The child was perhaps 6 years old, part of a family from one of the outlying farms who had made it to town just before the roads closed, and from town to the cliff when the town became untenable. He had seemed fine when he arrived. He had arrived on his own 2 feet, but sometime in the deep middle of the night, his breathing changed. Clara, who had not slept, who had been sitting with her back against the wall, watching the cave with the particular vigilance of someone performing a private penance, heard it first. A slight catch. A texture in the breath that hadn't been there before. Clara had sat with fever before. She knew what it sounded like in the dark. She was at Wren's shoulder before she had consciously decided to move. "The boy," she said quietly. "Third from the left. Listen." Wren listened. Too warm. Not the cold they had been fighting all night, but the opposite. A fever building, the body now working against a different kind of enemy. She went out into the night. Clara stood up without being asked. She went to the boy's mother, crouched beside her, spoke quietly so as not to wake the others. The mother's eyes flew open. Clara kept her voice steady and her hands on the woman's arms. "Wren is getting what she needs," Clara said. "She knows what to do. Stay with him. Talk to him. Let him hear your voice." The mother bent over her son and began to speak in the low, continuous murmur that is not really language anymore, but sound. The sound of a parent's presence, which is its own kind of medicine. Outside, in the dark and the killing cold, Wren moved along the frozen creek bank to the stand of willows she had identified weeks earlier. She stripped what she could reach, her hands working quickly in the bitter air, the cold biting at her fingers with increasing insistence, and carried the bark back to the cave. She had been outside for nearly 20 minutes. She did not mention this. She went directly to the fire and began the preparation, her cold hands moving with the efficiency of someone performing a task stored in memory rather than calculated in the moment. Clara sat beside her without speaking and without being asked, passing water when Wren needed water, holding the vessel when Wren's hands needed to be free. They worked together in the firelight with the ease of people who have found a shared rhythm. And neither of them remarked on the fact that the last time they had occupied a room together, one of them had been sleeping and the other had been signing a piece of paper. The boy's fever peaked sometime before dawn, and then, with the slow, reluctant receding of something that has been fought to a standstill, began to fall. His mother pressed her lips to his forehead and held them there. Her shoulders, which had been carrying an invisible weight since the change in his breathing, finally, slowly, lowered. She looked across the cave at Wren. Wren was already looking at something else, already moving on. It was in the hour before dawn that Clara did what she did. The cave was quiet. Wren was at the fire, tending it, when she heard the quiet sound of deliberate movement behind her. She did not turn. She had learned, in the course of the night, to distinguish the sounds that required attention from the sounds that were simply the evidence of sleeping bodies. This sound did not require attention. It was very quiet, very deliberate. Harriet Voss was sitting 3 feet away, her back against the wall, her eyes open. She had not slept. She watched Clara move across the cave to where Wren had set down her outer coat, the one she had stopped wearing hours ago when the sustained activity had made it unnecessary. Clara lifted the coat. She looked at it for a moment. Then she took off her own wool sweater, the good one, thick and well-made, the one she had put on before leaving home because she had understood, on some level, that she might not be returning. And she folded it once, carefully, and laid it over Wren's sleeping form. Wren was asleep. She had finally allowed herself to sleep in the hour when the boy's fever broke and the cave had reached a stable equilibrium that did not require her constant management. Clara stood over her for a moment, looking at the girl, 11 years old, thin, with hands that had become something that no child's hands should be, uncurling now in sleep from the fists they spent the waking hours prepared to be. Looking at the face that had unsettled every adult in Stonefield for 2 years, with its refusal to perform the emotions they expected. In sleep, it was simply a child's face. Clara turned away. She walked back to her spot against the wall. She sat down. She found Harriet Voss's eyes on her across the dark space between them. The two women looked at each other. No performance, no social calculation, no careful management of impression. Just two people in a stone room in the middle of a terrible season, seeing each other clearly for what may have been the first time. Clara had signed the paper. Harriet had raised her hand first. They had never spoken about it, had circled each other in church pews and across market stalls with the careful distance of people who share a guilt they've agreed not to name. Now Harriet looked at the wool sweater draped over the sleeping child. Then she looked at her own hands in her lap. She turned them over. She looked at the palms, the hands that had raised themselves without hesitation at a church gathering and voted to send that child into the cold. She did not sleep. Morning came as a change in the quality of the darkness. The storm had shifted sometime in the deep night, the wind dropping, the driven snow thinning. By the time the light began its slow return, the sound against the cave door had changed from a roar to something quieter, not silence, but its approach. Tobias was the one who said it first. He had spent the night in the secondary chamber with Ghost, sleeping against her warm flank, and had woken with the particular clarity that comes from genuine physical rest after genuine physical fear. "It's slowing down," he said. Wren was already awake. She went to the door. She put her hand against it and felt the absence of the percussion that had been there for days. The constant, insistent hammering of the wind's full force had receded to something that still had weight, but no longer felt like an argument. She unbolted the door and opened it 6 inches. Cold air entered, sharp and immediate, but not the killing cold of the storm's peak. Something that could be faced. Something that had, in some meaningful way, been survived. Through the gap, she could see the valley below. Snow had accumulated to a depth that changed the landscape entirely. Familiar contours buried, the creek invisible beneath the surface, the willows buried to their upper branches. The world had been remade while 24 people kept each other warm inside a mountain. "It's going to be all right," Tobias said from behind her. "Not yet," Wren said, "but soon." She closed the door. Cole Briggs was sitting up. He reached into the pack he had grabbed in the 10 frantic minutes between the wall giving way and the temperature dropping to something unsurvivable. His hand found what he was looking for, a coil of rope. Good rope, thick braided, made with the care of a craftsman who understands that the people using his work will be depending on it in the moments when depending on something matters most. His father had made it, the last work the forge had produced before the coal ran out and the fire went cold. Cole had carried it because it was useful and because some part of him, moving on instinct through the chaos of the wall giving way, had reached for the thing his father had made. Cole stood up and carried the rope across the cave to where Wren was rebuilding the fire. He held it out. She looked up at him. "Good rope," he said. His voice was rough in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. "My pa made it. It's yours." Wren took the coil. She turned it in her hands, testing the weight, feeling the braid, reading the quality of it the way she read everything. It was good rope, made by someone who knew what rope was for and had cared about making it right. She looked at Cole. He was 13 years old, nearly 14, standing in a cave that a girl he had thrown stones at had built from nothing, offering her the last good thing his family had carried out of their home. "Thank you," she said. Both of them understood the word. It contained the distance between who he had been and who he was becoming, measured not in miles, but in the simple act of extending something useful towards someone he had once tried to diminish. Cole nodded. He went back to sit beside his brother. Wren used the rope that morning to rig a drying frame across the upper chamber, suspended between natural anchor points in the stone. She hung strips of smoked meat from it, the stores she had built over months of careful work, spreading them to maximize what could be distributed across however many days it would take the storm to fully clear. The frame held. Harriet Voss looked at the frame. At the meat hanging from the rope, a neighbor's son had carried through a storm to give to a girl who had no reason to accept gifts from anyone connected to the Voss family. She looked at it for a long time. Then she got up without being asked and began distributing the first portions of the morning. She moved through the cave with the water vessel and the food, giving to each person in the order Wren had established. Most vulnerable first, then the children, then the adults, then herself last. She did it with the steady, unhurried efficiency of someone who has decided that the moment for opinions has passed and the moment for work has arrived. There was nothing to say that would not have sounded like too little, too late. So she moved instead, because movement was the only language left to her that still had any integrity. Outside, the storm was slowing. Inside, 24 people were alive and warm and fed. And Wren Calloway, who had been sent into the wilderness to disappear, was tending the fire she had built from nothing in the home she had carved from stone, keeping warm the people who had told her she had no place among them. The storm ended the way hard things often end, not with drama, but with a slow, quiet withdrawal, as though it had simply finished what it came to do and had no further interest in the aftermath. The morning it broke fully, Wren opened the cave door and stood in the entrance and looked out at a world that had been remade. The valley was unrecognizable. The snow had buried everything familiar and replaced it with an unbroken white that caught the returning light and held it, so that the whole landscape seemed to glow from within, clean and indifferent, and utterly without remorse for what it had done. She stood there for a long time. Ghost came to stand behind her, the mare's warm breath moving past her ear in slow clouds, and for a moment they were both still, looking out at the changed world together. Behind them, 23 people began the process of waking into whatever came next. They made their way back to Stonefield over 2 days, moving in small groups as the snow allowed passage. Wren went first with Ghost, breaking trail through the deepest drifts, reading the buried landscape beneath her feet with the knowledge Eli had given her, where the ground was solid, where it dropped away, where the snow concealed something other than earth. The town that emerged from the white was not the town they had left. Roofs had surrendered under the accumulated weight. Fences were gone. The mill was damaged. One wall buckled inward. The general store's windows had not survived, and birds had already found their way inside through the gaps, picking through what remained of the shelves. It looked like a place that had been abandoned for years rather than days, as though the storm had aged it forward by a decade in a single season. The people of Stonefield moved through the wreckage of their own lives with the particular silence of those confronting the distance between what they had believed would hold and what had actually held. They had believed in their houses, their stores, their reverend's assurances. The storm had had a conversation with all of those beliefs, and the conclusions were written plainly in the snow. What had held was a cave. What had held was stone. What had held was the knowledge of a child they had sent away to die. Gerald was the first to find what was left of the church cellar. He had gone looking for salvageable supplies and found the cellar door standing open, the lock broken from outside by a hand that had come here in the storm's worst hours and done what needed doing. Inside, the shelves were empty except for the ghost of what had been there. Impressions in the wood where sacks had rested, the faint smell of flour and preserved food in the cold air. He found a piece of paper on the floor near the door, 5 words in a 14-year-old boy's handwriting. Food here, for everyone. Gerald stood in the cellar for a long time. He thought about his daughter May and her hands wrapped around 2 of Wren's fingers in the firelight, and the way May had said, "Your hands are warm," with the complete trust of a child who does not yet know how to be guarded about her gratitude. He thought about a joke he had made in his store, about a girl who lived in a hole in the ground. He folded the note carefully and put it in his coat pocket. He carried it there for the rest of his life. Reverend Graves was found 2 days after the storm broke. He was seated in the front pew. His Bible was open on his lap, the pages riffled by some cold draft that had found its way in. His eyes were closed. His hands rested on either side of the book with the particular stillness that belongs only to things that have stopped. The cellar beneath his feet was empty. He had eaten everything he had taken, alone, in the cold, in the church where he had delivered his certainties from the pulpit for 5 years. And it had not been enough. Not enough food, not enough warmth, not enough of anything that a man accumulates through the careful, sustained project of making himself the most important person in a room. Clara stood in the doorway of the church and looked at him for a long time. She thought about the night he had come to her door with a piece of paper, the way he had stood in the light of her lamp and watched her hand move across the page, and the particular satisfaction in his face that she had recognized even then and had chosen to ignore. "He ate alone," she said softly, "every bite, alone." No one added anything to that. The sentence contained everything that needed to be said. The man who had kept others from the warmth of shared provision had died in the cold of his own keeping. The logic of it was not satisfying. It was simply true, carrying in it the weight of cause and consequence without any of the comfort of justice. Wren looked at Graves and felt nothing that resembled satisfaction. She felt the grief she always felt at unnecessary death, the particular grief of someone who has tried to give a warning and watched it refused. He had not needed to die here. That was the part that was hard to carry. Not that he had been wrong, but that being wrong had been a choice, repeated daily, and the choosing had led here. She turned away before the others did. There was still work to do. After the gathering, people drifted back toward the work of rebuilding. No one asked Wren where she would go. Perhaps they already knew. Perhaps they had always known that a person who builds her home from stone does not abandon it simply because the winter has passed. The gathering itself was held a week later, when the worst of the clearing had been done, and the most urgent repairs had been started, and the people of Stonefield had had enough time to sit with what had happened and arrive at something like words for it. They met outside in the open air on a morning when the sky had returned to the deep blue that follows storms. The light was clean and cold. No one suggested the church, and no one objected to the absence of the suggestion. Tobias Voss spoke first. He was 14, and his voice cracked twice while he was speaking, and he did not stop for either crack. He said what he had seen: the cellar, his mother's face when he told her, the decision to go back through the storm and break the lock. He said it plainly, without drama, the way someone speaks when they are reporting rather than performing. Then he said something that had not been part of any plan. She told us. She came to every door. She stood in front of Reverend Graves and told him too. And we, all of us, we decided that what we already believed was more important than what she was saying. He stopped. He looked at his boots. I don't know what to do with that. I just think it needs to be said out loud. The crowd was quiet in a way that had weight to it. Harriet Voss stepped forward. She stood straight, the way she always stood, the posture of a woman who had built her life on the premise that certainty is a form of authority. But something in that certainty had changed. It had been replaced by something else that occupied the same space in her bearing but felt entirely unlike it. Not weakness. Something harder than certainty, actually. The thing that comes after certainty has been proven wrong, and you choose to stay standing anyway, because falling down would be easier, and you have decided that easier is not what you deserve. I raised my hand first, she said, at the vote. I want everyone here to know that. Not because I believed Reverend Graves more than I believed my own eyes. I had seen the flood she predicted. I had seen the frost arrive exactly when she said it would. I knew. Her voice was steady. I raised my hand because I was afraid that if she was right, then everything I had built my understanding of the world on was fragile. I chose my comfort over her safety. I want to say that plainly, in front of everyone here, so there is no version of this story where my part in it is smaller than it was. She did not look at Wren while she spoke. She looked at the assembled faces of her neighbors, the people she had lived beside, organized beside, worshipped beside for years. I am not asking to be forgiven, she said. I am only asking that the truth be the truth. She stepped back. Clara was the last to speak before Wren. She came forward slowly, as though each step required a separate decision. She was thinner than she had been. The months of shared hardship had left their mark on her frame in ways that winter tends to leave marks. But her eyes, when she raised them, were clearer than they had been in a long time. Grief, it turns out, clarifies. It strips away everything that isn't necessary and leaves you with only what is real. I kept her the longest, Clara said. 4 months. I gave her a bed and I fed her and I let her sleep under a quilt I made for my own daughter. She stopped. Something moved across her face that she did not hide. And then a man came to my door with a piece of paper and I signed it, while she was asleep, while she was sleeping under that quilt. Her hands were not steady. She held them together in front of her. I knew she was right. I had known it since the flood. I signed anyway because I was more afraid of Reverend Graves' disapproval than I was of what my signing would cost her. She was quiet for a moment. There is no excuse for that, she said. There is only what I have tried to do since, and it will never be enough. Owen Garrett's son found Wren at the edge of the gathering. He was a quiet man in his 30s, with his father's broad build and none of his father's ease with words. He had been carrying the letter in his coat pocket since his father's last morning, not knowing what to do with it, not knowing whether the girl was alive to receive it. He held it out without preamble. Wren took it. She felt the weight of it. Not physical weight. The paper was thin, but the other kind. The weight of something that has been held a long time and has absorbed into itself the urgency of the hand that held it. She opened it. She read it once, standing at the edge of the gathered crowd with her back half turned, her face unreadable. Then she walked to the center of the gathering. "There is something else," she said, her voice carried in the cold air. "Something that belongs to all of you." She read the letter aloud. Owen Garrett's voice, in her reading of it, was exactly what it had been. The voice of a man running out of time and trying to spend what remained of it on the one thing that actually needed doing. She read his account of the cave, how he had sheltered there once, long ago, as a young man in a hard season, how he had carved his name and his confession into the back wall and then walked away and told no one, how he had known, when they sent her into the wilderness, that the cave existed and that it could hold warmth and that she might find it and survive. How he had said nothing. She read, "I was wrong to stay silent. Twice. Once when I was young and left without telling anyone. Once when I was old and watched her walk away." The crowd was very still. She folded the letter when she finished. She held it against her coat for a moment. The same coat she had been wearing the morning she walked out of Stonefield with a blanket and a sack of cornmeal and a dead man's knife. "He called himself a coward," she said. "I call him human. We are all afraid of something. The question is not whether we are afraid." She looked at the faces before her, Clara, Harriet, Gerald, Tobias, Cole, and all the others, the ones who had voted, and the ones who had simply not spoken, and the ones who had been too young to have a vote but had grown up inside the decision. The question is what you do after you know you were wrong. Mr. Garrett didn't get there in time to do it out loud, but he tried to do it in the only way left to him. She paused. "You still can." No one spoke. The hawk that had been circling above the valley tilted its wings and slid east on a current of air, patient and unhurried, as though it had been there for all of it and had its own conclusions. Wren looked at the letter in her hands one more time before putting it back against her coat. She thought about Owen Garrett sitting at his kitchen table in the last weeks of his life, choosing his words. She thought about the care he must have taken, crossing out sentences, starting again, trying to find the exact shape of what he owed. People who are out of time become very careful with it. They stop spending words on anything that doesn't matter. She thought about his handwriting, which she had read for the first time standing at the edge of a crowd, and which she would read many more times in the years that followed, on winter evenings when the fire burned low, and she needed to remember that even the people who had failed her had carried their failures like stones, heavy and private, all the way to the end. That was not nothing. That was, in its way, a kind of loyalty to the truth, even if the loyalty had arrived too late to do any practical good. She folded the letter carefully and put it back in her pocket. "You still can," she said again, and turned and walked back toward the cliff and the cave and the life she had built there, leaving the gathered town to do what it would with the morning. The cave was her home. It had been her home since she built it, and it remained so through every season that followed, through the springs that came after that winter with the particular sweetness of things that have been waited for, through the summers that filled the valley below the cliff with grass and wildflowers, through the autumns when the aspens turned and their gold was, each time, a kind of answer to everything the dark seasons had asked. She expanded it over the years. New chambers, carved with tools better than a single hunting knife, though the knife was always the first one she reached for. The network of rooms grew slowly, the way anything grows when it is tended with patience and used for actual purpose. A room for teaching, because people came to learn. A room for storage deep enough to hold months of supplies. A room for guests, because there were always guests. Cole Briggs came back the following spring. He stood at the cave entrance with his hat in his hands and asked if she would teach him. He had begun to lower himself in some gesture of respect, and she stopped him. "Nobody needs to kneel to learn," she said. "Stand up." He stood up. He stayed for the better part of a year, learning everything she would teach. The reading of land and weather, the building of shelters that held heat, the setting of snares, the identification of what was useful in the natural world and what was dangerous. The 100 small competencies that Eli had passed to Wren and that Wren now passed to Cole. He became, in time, the most respected guide in the mountain region. When anyone asked who had taught him, his answer never changed. "A girl," he said. 11 years old when I met her. The whole town called her a liar." He always paused there, not for effect, because even after all those years, the next part still cost him something to say. She was the only one telling the truth. Harriet Voss did something that no one who knew her before that winter would have predicted. She gathered what remained of her family's resources and established a fund. It had no formal name. It was simply known in the region as the arrangement, a quiet mechanism by which any child who wanted an education and could not pay for it received one without ceremony, without condition, without anyone making a speech about it. She did not ask Wren's permission. She did not announce it with any of the public gravity she had once attached to her opinions. She simply did it with the same directness she had always brought to her decisions, except that now the direction had changed. The capacity for decisive action, it turned out, was not the problem. It had never been the problem. Tobias grew into a steady, quiet man who spent his life repairing the things the storm had damaged. Not just buildings, but the smaller, less visible things. He became the kind of neighbor that every community needs and rarely recognizes. The one who shows up before he is asked, who fixes the thing that needed fixing 3 weeks ago, who sits with the difficult and the grieving without requiring them to be grateful for it. He had learned in that long winter in the cave that gratitude is not a requirement for help. Help is its own justification. Gerald rebuilt his general store with a roof that could hold twice the snow load of the previous one. He kept the note in his coat pocket until the paper wore through. Then he copied the 5 words onto a fresh piece and kept that too. When his daughter May was old enough to ask why he kept an old piece of paper in his pocket, he told her the whole story. She listened with the particular attention of a child who understands she is being given something important. May grew up to become a teacher. She taught her students to watch the birds. The children of Stonefield, and eventually their children, and their children after that, grew up with a different relationship to the mountain than their parents had. They learned to notice when the animals changed their behavior. They learned to take warning seriously, even when the warning came from an unexpected source. They learned that the land speaks a language that is available to everyone but requires practice to hear, and that the practice is simply paying attention. They called it the old way. No one remembered exactly where that phrase had come from. It had entered the local language the way all the most useful things do, gradually, without announcement, becoming simply part of how people spoke about what they knew. Clara Maddox came to the cave every autumn for 12 years. She brought bread, always the same kind, a dense, dark loaf that kept well in the cold. She brought yarn. She sat in the cave beside the fire and knitted while Wren worked or watched the sky. And they existed together in a silence that was not the silence of things unsaid, but the silence of things that had been said, had been absorbed, and no longer required the medium of language. When Clara died, Wren carved her name into the cave wall in the chamber nearest the entrance. She placed Clara's knitting needles on the small shelf she had carved there. They stayed. Ghost died in the summer of her 16th year. She went peacefully in the meadow where she had first appeared. The same valley, unfrozen now, green and warm, the willows full and alive along the creek. Wren found her there in the morning, lying on her side with her eyes open and the particular stillness that is different from sleep in a way that every person who has loved an animal understands without being taught. She buried her at the entrance to the cave. The stone marker read 3 words. She walked to me. Copper had been gone for years by then, had disappeared one spring morning without ceremony or farewell, as though he had completed whatever it was he had come to do, and had returned to the business of being a fox. Wren understood this. When you are no longer alone, the things that came to keep you company in your aloneness find other business. The winter that Wren turned 74 was a gentle one. The cold came in slowly, politely almost, without the sudden violence of that long-ago season. The snow was light. The creek stayed partially open through most of it, and the willows along its banks kept their silver color against the white. She sat in her cave in the evenings and watched the fire burn. The stone walls around her were smooth where she had worked them more than 6 decades earlier, and the natural warmth still rose from the earth below and was held in the rock and given back to the room in the slow, patient way of things that have been doing what they do for longer than human memory reaches. She put her hand against the wall. The stone was warm. She had done this every evening for 63 years. It was the first thing she did when she came inside and the last thing she did before she slept. This simple act of pressing her palm to the wall and feeling what the mountain had stored and was now offering back. She had never tired of it. If anything, she found it more remarkable with each passing year, not less. The patience of stone, the long, unhurried generosity of heat returning. In her coat pocket was the letter. She had carried it through every season since Owen Garrett's son had pressed it into her hands at the gathering, through the good years and the hard years, through the teaching and the building and the visiting and the long solitary stretches of high country winters that she had come to love, the way you love anything that has asked the most of you and given the most back. She had never answered it. There was no one to answer it to. Owen Garrett was gone, and the debt he had described was not the kind that correspondence could settle, but she had carried it. That was its own kind of answer. She had carried the voice of a man who had failed her and chosen, instead of discarding it, to keep it close, to refuse to let it be forgotten, to hold it against her through 6 decades of high country winters as though to say, I heard you. You spoke too late, but I heard you. The fire burned down to embers that glowed the color of the sandstone walls around her. Above the entrance to the cave, In the letters she had carved there herself the year after the great winter, the stone said what it always said. The mountain told me. I told you. Now we both know. She was not a mountain. She had never been a mountain. The mountain does not choose. It only stands and holds and waits and does not care what becomes of the creatures sheltering in its shadow. She had been a girl and then a woman who had chosen. Again and again, through every season of a long and solitary life, she had chosen to be something the mountain could never be. She had chosen to be merciful, and mercy, unlike stone, does not erode. It does not crack in the frost, or crumble in the rain, or collapse under the weight of what accumulates on top of it. It holds. It holds because it is not passive. It is not merely enduring, merely persisting. It is active. It is the daily decision, repeated until the deciding becomes the person, to extend warmth to the people standing in the cold outside your door. Even the people who put them there, even them. The embers cooled. Outside, the night moved through the valley in its slow, patient way, telling its truth to anyone willing to listen, to the animals who heard it and prepared, to the land that received it without opinion, to the stones that held it and gave it back in warmth. That was what she had built here. Not just walls and a roof and a fire. Something else. Something that would outlast the stone itself, passing from one pair of hands to the next in the long chain of those who had learned it, that the capacity to help is a kind of obligation, that knowledge is only complete when it is given away, that mercy is not weakness, but the hardest form of strength there is. She had learned it from Eli. Eli had learned it from the mountains, and the mountains had learned it from something older than any of them could name. The earth had told her everything it knew. She had listened. She had built from the listening. And in the end, that was all any life could ask of itself, to hear what is true, and to act on it, and to teach the hearing to whoever comes next. The fire went out. The stone held its warmth. She slept. This is a work of fiction. All characters, locations, and events are entirely imaginary and created for the purpose of cinematic storytelling. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or actual events is purely coincidental.